right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders. Thank you all so much for joining me for the podcast. If you are new to the podcast, this is a question and answer based podcast where you get to send me, the therapist, questions about OCD and anxiety stuff, and I will likely put it up in a future episode and give you my thoughts and suggestions and recommendations and meanderings and snarky weird jokes or bad dad jokes. I don't know, either one of those. But either way, I will talk about it, and hopefully it will be helpful. So while that is typically the case, and you can send me a question over at fearcastpodcast.com, and you can find every episode there as well. You can also find me over at Instagram. I am Fearcast Podcast over there. You can send me an audio question over there as well by sending me a DM and recording your voice in it, and I get it, and I put it up. That audio question will cut to the top of the line and be next recorded, and that is an option for you if you are one of the impatient types, and that's okay too. But today we don't even have a question. Today I got to interview John Abramowitz. So Dr. John Abramowitz has been a researcher, a writer, an educator. He does all the things in regards to OCD. He's been around OCD land for as far as I've been in, and I think I mentioned that in the interview. But I was so lucky to have him on today to talk about a new book that he's coming out with called Living Well With OCD. So we talk a little bit about the book, talk a little bit about who it's for, why he wrote it, what was missing in the current literature that asked for a book like this, since I know there's a ton of books out there. So we go into a lot of that. We go into some of the specific parts about his book. More importantly, we go over some like theoretical discussion. I hope it doesn't get too boring for anybody, but we talk about why he uses the approaches in the book that he's referring to, rather than just sticking with what a lot of folks do, which is just the ERP CBT route, which is also great. But we get to nerd out just a little bit, and hopefully it isn't too offensive or awful or just aggressively boring. But either way, let me tell you a little bit about John, and then I'll get into that interview. So John Abramowitz is a licensed clinical psychologist and health services provider with a private practice in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He specializes in the treatment of OCD and other anxiety disorders, and he is widely recognized as a leading authority on these topics. He's also professor and associate chair of psychology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he trains clinical psychologists and conducts research on OCD and anxiety disorders. Dr. Abramowitz writes books and research articles for professionals and has published a self-help book in the past, Getting Over OCD. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. John Abramowitz. All right, Dr. John Abramowitz, thank you so much for joining me today for the podcast to chat about your new book. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So you have been in the OCD and anxiety world for forever. As far as I've been in it, your name has floated around. And so this new book you just came out with, one, I'm just so glad to have you on. I'm not going to force you to bring up our previous conversation about music gear, but I've wanted to talk to you about that for a while. But for those of you who don't know, Dr. Abramowitz is an avid guitar player, as far as I know, in addition to being an amazing educator and therapist, and researcher for that matter. But wanted to chat about your new book, Living Well With OCD.
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. Well, so tell us a little bit about that book. So where did the idea of this book come from? Where did it come from? There's a gazillion books out there for OCD now, which is fantastic. But where did the idea for this book come from?
Yeah, we've come a long way. When I first got into the field in the mid-1990s, when I was in graduate school, and there were precious few books about OCD for professionals and for folks with OCD and their families and all of that, self-help books. And now, like you said, we've just seen, a proliferation of that, which is wonderful. One thing that's missing is, we have all these great books that describe how to do effective treatment, exposure and response prevention, and ACT and things like that. And we have some books for family members. What we don't have, and what I think, kind of pushed me in the direction of writing this book, is a book for folks who either are struggling with exposure and response prevention, which is the number one, treatment, the first line treatment. This is a challenging treatment. And there are lots of folks that kind of hear about it and they're like, nope, not me. Mm-hmm. And so we don't have a book for them. And we also know that even when we have a successful course of treatment, we might reduce OCD symptoms, but we don't necessarily reduce all the collateral damage with OCD. So OCD gets in the way of people's relationships. It gets in the way of their work. It gets in the way of their leisure time, managing stress, family relationships. And this is a book for folks who have OCD. Maybe they still have residual symptoms after treatment, but it's how to address some of those collateral areas, some of those, kind of issues related to OCD, and how to manage with the disorder. And there's also some techniques that can help to reduce OCD symptoms that are not exposure and response prevention. They're not the first line treatment, but they're, in some cases, they've been shown to be effective.
I think that's fantastic. In kind of poking around in the book and reading a little bit of it, I've really liked how broad it is. That the word that came to mind, and I don't want it to sound like an insult. I think it's actually great. It's playing the hits. It's like it goes through, and I think this is great for folks who are looking for just like a book that goes through all the different aspects of treatment, what OCD is, and really outlines explicitly, here is one tool that you can use, here's another tool that you can use, and then it goes into all those different aspects of someone's life, and here's a tool, so that you can try them out and see what works for you, and I really like that.
I'm glad that kind of comes through, because as I was working on it, and of course, when you write a book, you have an editor who's kind of proverbially looking over your shoulder, giving you feedback, and though I had a couple of folks in that case from Guilford, they're a wonderful publisher, but they were all like, give strategies, more like practical, hands-on. Here's what you can do. Mm-hmm. And so that was what was going through my mind as I was writing this. And I'm glad that, you're saying that really comes through in the book.
Absolutely. And I think and they all seem very, very practical and very doable.
That's the idea. Yeah. Look, people aren't going to do stuff if it's hard and is kind of, doesn't make sense and all that. So these are all, very practical. I spell out, like, here's a worksheet for this. Most of them don't have worksheets. A few of them do. Mm-hmm. Here's when you would do this. Here's how you do it. And it's a lot of stuff that we don't typically see in books about OCD.
Can you expand more on that?
Yeah. So, for example, there are, I spent a lot of time going through communication patterns, because mm-hmm. I find that, so someone goes through treatment for OCD, or maybe they have OCD and they're not doing treatment. It's one thing to have the OCD symptoms yourself and experience the anxiety and the compulsive rituals and the obsessions. But then what about when you talk to other people about it, mm-hmm. and or if you're trying to get other people to do rituals and accommodate, and that often leads to arguments, and other people are trying to use logic with you. It's not dangerous. So I talk a lot about, here are some skills for how to talk about your OCD to other people, whether that's people in your family, whether that's someone at work or at school, whether it's a potential romantic partner. And what to say and what not to say, and when's a good time to discuss this, because it turns out that makes a big difference in terms of how do you live with OCD. Mm-hmm. You can have OCD, and you can I don't know what I says. You can have OCD and you can communicate with other people in ways that turn them away from you. They don't want to help you at all. Or you can have OCD and you can communicate in ways that garner understanding and support. And that's what I want people to be able to do.
I love that. And I love that it in kind of looking through that chapter, there's the acknowledgement that it's not a black and white. That it can be a progressive introduction for folks on what OCD is. And I know I've done an episode on this or talked about this in the past. That we can slowly start to lay it out to somebody, and the person who's listening to this, person who has lived experience with OCD, it's your story to tell. You get to control how much you're going to share or not. And I think that whole section of the book talks about how you can start to communicate that and share that with family and friends who need to know. And also there are people who don't need to know and haven't deserved to know.
That's exactly right. And how to establish boundaries so that if you're telling someone else for the first time that you got OCD and the conversation goes in a direction you don't want, how to keep boundaries and to say, okay, you know what? I've said all I wanted to say right now. So I go into that. And that's right. It's like you said, I think that's in the book. It's your story to tell. And you get to decide. And so how do you think through how you're going to come out about having OCD? There are not a lot of books that talk about that. I couldn't find any at all when I was looking through the literature.
No, no. It's tough to think about a book that explicitly talks about that aspect of things. And that's where I think that this book is really good. There's a lot of books out there that can be, here's an introduction to OCD. Here is, different tools to use along the way. Here's something specific to this subtype. But it feels like it's for someone who's kind of in the middle late stage of treatment, where they've gotten the basics, they're starting to work on things. They may need a little bit of reminder of here are some other things that they can do. But it's how to integrate that into the course of their life. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, most people who do even the most effective treatments that we have, they're still left with some OCD, some obsessions and compulsions. I've worked with lots of folks with OCD, and it's hard for me to point to more than a handful who really had zero, symptoms when everything was all said and done. They're often very manageable, but there are, we have to be honest, our treatment is good, but it's not a panacea. It's not for everyone. And people sometimes have lapses and relapses. And so that's what this is aimed for.
Love it. And it's not selling this false hope that, this is the magic book. I'm not saying don't get this book, everybody. What I'm saying is it's an honest portrayal of what life can be and what life can look like. It's that it's one of those things to incorporate into who it is that you are. I think that we get stuck in this idea of getting mad at ourselves for having the brains that we have. And I speak broadly on this, whether or not you have depression, ADHD, whatever it might be, OCD for that matter. It's we have this brain, and we have to find out a way to live effectively with the brain that we have. When we expect us to have someone else's brain, that's where we start to get stuck and pissed off and start going down rabbit holes to force ourselves into something that we just simply aren't.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. How do we manage through life with whatever we're dealt with, whatever our circumstances are? I think that's really important.
In the course of your work, what are some pitfalls that you find people keep stepping into in the course of treatment that either get them stuck at various stages, or get them stuck in the place that perhaps this book is written to, where it feels like they can't really integrate that into a functional way of living that is thriving? Yeah,
I don't know what it is, but recently I have worked with a number of folks who have used the treatment inappropriately. And I think that they are learning this, unfortunately, from some therapists who they just get out the exposure hammer and everything's a nail. Don't get me wrong, exposure. I love exposure therapy, helping people to approach things that they're afraid of. There is no better way to overcome your fear than to let experience teach you that your fear is safe if you have OCD or phobias or things like that, social anxiety. But sometimes people with OCD will use exposure therapy as a ritual. Every time they feel anxious, oh, let me just do exposure to it and then I'll feel better. And what happens is they really are turning it into a ritual. Mm-hmm. Rituals in OCD are about trying to reduce anxiety. Exposure therapy is not about trying to reduce anxiety. Exposure therapy is about learning that certain situations you're afraid of are actually not dangerous. But sometimes the way that therapists introduce exposure and response prevention is, if you do this, you'll reduce your fear. And clients, patients, they pick up on that. And so they say, well, I'm afraid, so I'll just do exposure. I'm afraid of that, I'll do exposure. Mm-hmm. How come it's not getting better? How come I'm still afraid? Yeah, because you're basically doing, instead of washing or checking, you're doing exposure as a way to manage your OCD. For some reason, I'm seeing that more and more. And that is not directly addressed in my book, but I certainly do address it in therapy. And once we do address it and use a kind of a more flexible approach to doing exposure, that's based on optimizing inhibitory learning rather than optimizing habituation, folks can often turn it around and do really well.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a fantastic point. I probably have mentioned that in every IOCDF talk that I've ever done, is that every good tool that we suggest or talk about or recommend, every single one of them can be used negatively, can be used poorly, and can be used as compulsion. And it's about, but I totally get it. And I've had clients who've shared that. Why is exposure okay, but my compulsion is not? If my compulsion is meant to bring my anxiety down, why am I doing exposure and response prevention? Isn't that supposed to bring my anxiety down?
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that it's that we learn two things through exposures. We learn one, as you said, our worst fear is unlikely to happen. Right? It's that it's, quote, not dangerous. And I'm putting it in quotes because, driving is dangerous and we're going to do it all day. Eating food is dangerous and we're going to do that too.
Yep.
But the chances of us dying are very, 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 very slim.
Yeah. For something to be safe doesn't mean it has to have zero risk. Nothing has zero risk. Crossing the street is safe, but in most cases, but it doesn't have zero risk. Yeah. All right. So that's one thing that we learned, that the risk is acceptably low. And what's the other thing that we learned?
That we can handle anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what gets, I think, short shrift. Yeah. For a lot of therapists and folks with OCD, they don't. They don't use exposure to teach them that. Mm-hmm. They use exposure as a way of trying to get rid of the anxiety. They're focused too much on habituation. If I just stick it out and sit with it, my anxiety goes down. That doesn't always. It often happens, but it doesn't always happen. Mm-hmm. But while that's happening, you want to be learning, I can manage the anxiety, the uncertainty, the intrusive thoughts. I'm not a flickering candle that will go out with a gust of wind. I can manage this difficult stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are a lot. There are a lot of ways to be able to handle that feeling, but really, that we learn that feeling through exposure, that feeling is going to eventually go down anyways, right? I often say that as bad as you feel, as good as you feel, that's going to change.
Right.
Right.
I love that. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So you mentioned inhibitory learning just a few moments ago. Yeah. And that's been an approach that kind of got really popular about probably 3, 4, or 5 years ago. At least it came to my awareness a couple of years ago. And then we hear more about that at conferences, and that's being talked about. ACT is still extremely popular, is used quite a bit. Your book also incorporates inference-based CBT information. Tell me about this kind of more eclectic approach that you're coming from. I know that you've hit you beat the drum of ERP for many, many years. But you're also incorporating all these different approaches. Tell us the reason for incorporating everything.
Yeah, well, so we have evidence that ACT can be helpful for OCD. We have evidence that inference-based CBT can be helpful for OCD. So why not use those, especially if the main first line treatment, exposure and response prevention, either you've tried it hasn't worked, or you find that unacceptable. That doesn't mean you just sit around and do nothing. There are other things that you can do that have some evidence that are based on theory. So I've incorporated that into the book as well.
Is it are we, should the reader presume that all those approaches are, I don't say interchangeable, but complementary to one another or dovetail into each other? Or are there some approaches that you would recommend at different times for different people?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are some people listening who might want to slap me after I say this, but I think that these different techniques, whether it's exposure therapy, cognitive therapy, ACT, inference-based, I think that they all have more in common than their differences, right? I think that they're, at the end of the day, they're all about helping folks to do two things. One of them is helping them to change the way that they think, right? Because we know any cognitive, these are all cognitive behavioral, under the big umbrella of cognitive behavior therapy. And the whole idea of cognitive behavior therapy is the way that we think influences the way we feel, our emotions, like anxiety, and what we do, like compulsive rituals and avoidance strategies. So all of these four kind of techniques, they overlap in terms of helping people to change the way they think. Now they have different methods, and they have, they look very different when you do them, but they all do that. The other thing that I believe that these all do in one way or another is that they all, in one way or another, they try to get the person to engage with their feared stimuli. Now, right now, exposure and response prevention is the most, kind of upfront about it. We're going to make a list of what you're afraid of, and we're doing it. We're leaning in. In cognitive therapy, we have behavioral experiments that we use to test out beliefs. So if we're doing cognitive therapy about your ability to tolerate uncertainty or misinterpretation of intrusive thoughts, then we're going to test it out. Let's go, hold that knife and see if you really end up, stabbing someone as a test. In ACT, there is not a specific, let's go and confront your fears. But the whole idea of ACT is let's lean into distress and anxiety while you're doing the things that are of value to you. Well, how do you do that? What's kind of written under the hood there is exposure and response prevention. Go face your fears, bring on those intrusive thoughts, bring on that anxiety, and do what's important to you and see that you can manage. And inference-based, I'm not as familiar with that. I'm learning more and more about it, but I know that there are techniques that are used. Reality sensing, I think, is the name of the technique, where the person is kind of told, now turn away from your imagination and go into your real life and basically do face your fears. Don't do your rituals. They don't say it up front like that, but folks that I've spoken to who are experts on ICBT, who have done the training, they all say, yeah, that overlaps a lot with what we're doing. So I think that's not a bad thing that they overlap. Because people are, need more or less direct ways of doing it, of changing their cognitions. And it speaks, these different approaches speak differently to different people. I have found that we did a study comparing ACT and regular habituation-based exposure. And there were some folks and I was a therapist on that study, there were some folks where you start talking the ACT language and you lose them completely. Right. And I feel like if they were in the exposure therapy, condition, they would have done great. And other people who, like we were talking about before, they hijack the exposure, they hijack habituation. It's like, darn, I wish I could do ACT with this person. And I think it would be the same way for cognitive therapy or ICBT as well.
I'm 100% in agreement with you on this. Is that I have found that the approach and the language used in each of these models is going to resonate differently with with different people, and just in the way that they think about it. In fact, I'm currently working with someone where we started with traditional ERP, and it just wasn't hitting. It wasn't resonating. So we've shifted into doing ICBT, and they're thriving with it. It just resonates with the way that they think, the way that they approach the world. And I've shared my criticism on this podcast about, all these different approaches. I think there are limitations to all of them. I don't think anybody is going to disagree with that. But that being able to have these different approaches to reach someone's ears and then show them that there's a way to do this without just this one box, this one avenue, and that if you incorporate all these things, they're all, as you said, getting to this general approach. How do we spend less time thinking about the obsession and spend more time getting out there and living your life? And that's the whole point of the therapy thing in the first place, is to spend less time on one and more time on the other. So let's go do that. And all of them have their language and approach and philosophy around doing that. But I don't really care how you get there. Spend less time obsessing and compulsing, spend more time living.
Yeah, 100%. I think, when you get into in academia, people want to, and maybe I'm guilty of the same thing. People want to, although I didn't invent a therapy, I just study it and try to make them better, try to make them all better, honestly. But in my research, but you have people that kind of stake their claim. This is the therapy that I invented, or my mentor, studied, and so and it's different, and it's new, and it's better, and the turf stuff in academia does not help. I think if anything, it confuses folks who really should understand what we're talking about. That, this is all about, like we talked about, changing behavior, changing your thinking. And there are lots of different ways to do it, or there's not one, right or wrong way. It turns out, though, in the state of the literature right now, exposure and response prevention very clearly. So, I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. There's no doubt exposure and response prevention has the most solid evidence-based foundation for OCD. And all things being equal, that is the first line treatment. That doesn't mean that these other therapies we're talking about can't be helpful. They all have some evidence that they can be effective. And maybe one day they'll be, the evidence will be as strong or maybe even stronger than it is for ERP. But right now, that's the state of the art.
I like that you called it turf warfare, in a sense. Is that there does seem to be at times, people come in with their approach, and they come in guns blazing with, this is the method that's gonna work, and it helps a lot, and it doesn't help other people. So if it's not going to work, and that's the magic bullet, what does that say for that individual who's struggling?
Exactly. When I was in grad school, the turf war was between behavior therapy and cognitive therapy. This is in the 90s, right? And so there were folks doing exposure therapy, and then there were folks doing cognitive therapy, like Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis and folks like that. And the whole idea was, and there were even studies, exposure therapy versus cognitive therapy. And if you read the studies, depending on who was designing and running the studies, they had these little slights toward the other therapy. So, for example, a cognitive therapy study.
Researchers are petty? What?
Oh my goodness! Newsflash, right?
Oh, goodness.
There's one study that I remember from like 1985 or something. They did cognitive therapy that included the kind of cognitive restructuring that we typically do, and behavioral experiments, which looked a lot like exposure therapy. And they compared it to an exposure therapy manual where none of the exposure was done in the session. It was all homework exposure. Go home and expose yourself. And not surprisingly, the cognitive therapy won. Actually, it didn't win. It was just as effective as the not so good ERP. And so you have people running around saying, look, cognitive therapy is just as good as exposure and response prevention. You don't have to do exposure. But people were doing exposure in the cognitive therapy groups. They were doing it under the label of behavioral experiments, but it was exposure. And in the exposure therapy groups, folks really weren't doing exposure. They were being told, here's your stuff that you should go do, but I'm not going to supervise you doing it. So we don't know what those people did.
Right.
And I think that we have seen that kind of play out over and over and over again, where folks want to take these treatments that really have so many overlapping elements, and they want to test them against each other. So they end up leaving out key elements of the other therapy so that they can show that one is better than the other. I don't think it's as egregious now as it was with cognitive therapy and exposure therapy, because I think the research has just gotten better and better over time, the methods. But yeah, there's these treatments overlap.
I'm about to make a very rare sports comparison or consideration. This is unheard of for me, but it in the course of the research, does it feel like initially, like I'm thinking about UFC, which I tend to not watch, but it's like the idea behind it being, we're going to have all these different, martial arts or different, fighting approaches, and we're going to pit them against each other and see which one wins. And what melded into was I forget, mixed martial arts. So just a conglomeration of all these different approaches into this one ultimate thing that all of a sudden everybody is doing. I don't think anybody's going in with like a traditional, Taekwondo approach against someone who practices this thing.
Tai Chi or something, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or fighting that against the now mixed martial arts that is designed for that fighting system.
Right.
Is there eventually going to be a mixed martial arts for OCD and anxiety disorders that is going to have a more combined approach that's going to include all these?
I think we should. We did, so another study actually part of the same study, we combined ACT and exposure. Now, here's the thing. We thought that would be better than exposure by itself. Yeah. And we were wrong. There was no difference. And I mean, even if you squint at the data, there were no differences. Now, but what I think that gets to is that people with OCD, like, what do they say? You've met one person with OCD and you've met one person with OCD, right? So it's such a heterogeneous problem that you really, when you have large groups of folks, it's hard to really pick out the individual differences. And like I said, I'm convinced there's some people who do better with ACT, and there's some people who do better with ERP. There are probably some people who do better with the inference-based, and there's some people who would do better with ACT or with exposure. In large studies where we have like hundreds of people, it's hard to pick that apart. I think the next step is we need to look more at what are those factors that predict who's going to do best with what sort of treatment. And we don't know a ton about that right now.
Okay, so my question is that, are there any inklings of that at this point? And it sounds like there just really aren't.
Not that I've seen convincingly. I think there are a lot of people who think that there are, but that's different than research.
Yeah, I've heard that there's they were doing some maybe DNA genetic testing to see maybe that was specific to what medications may or may not work for somebody. Is there any idea if that applies to therapy? Sounds like you've already answered that question.
Well, genetically, no, but it would be nice. Like, for a while, people thought that like pure obsessions, which I don't even like that term because they're not pure. People are still doing mental rituals and avoidance strategies and things like that. But people who have like, the sexual and aggressive and religious obsessions, that they don't respond to exposure and response prevention. And we know that that's just not correct. But there are still a lot of people who believe that and think those folks should have something different.
Right. So you're of the camp that, quote, pure O is OCD.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just think it's back in the day when that term was coined, we didn't really understand mental rituals very well. This is in the 90s. And people, in fact, like the early versions of the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, the Y-Box, didn't even include mental rituals as a main ritual. We didn't know to ask about it back then. But I think it's pretty clear now that there's no such thing as pure obsessions. If you have OCD, you're doing something about those unwanted thoughts.
It's mental behaviors.
It's mental behaviors. And our definition of what is a compulsion has really changed over the years. We've become more understanding about It's not just washing and checking and ordering, but there's slight things people can do. There's mental things, like you were saying, that people can do. Yeah.
No, I like hearing about how things are shifting and changing. That's why I really love that there are these incorporations of these new approaches. And I think it's also important to remember that just because a new approach comes out that is backed by research doesn't negate the previous approaches or say that they just simply will not ever work for you. I mean, one of the examples you talked about, just strict cognitive therapy. I think about Jeffrey Schwartz's book, the Brain Lock. His 4 steps was very popular for quite some time, but I don't hear much about that these days because it's been eclipsed by these other programs. And yet that approach did help people.
Yeah.
So it's not to say it's completely unhelpful. Now, granted, I don't know if I asked that question in your head, you're going, it's useless and it's terrible and it's breaking people.
No, not at all. So I remember when that book came out, I couldn't wait to, read it and everything. So I was digesting anything I could about OCD. It was like the mid 90s. Mm-hmm. The thing that I was not thrilled about with that book is it made it look easy. There's the 4 R's, right? Mm-hmm. And I forget what they are, but it's if we could do that, people with OCD could just do that, but then you wouldn't need any therapists or anything. It's harder than just read this, read that. The other thing I didn't like is they got really into the sexy brain pictures.
Those were fun, yes.
Do this, and it changes your brain and all that stuff. And of course, doing a treatment changes your brain. Our brains are changed as a result of this conversation in some way that may or may not be measurable. But I think he linked too much this idea that OCD is a brain disease, and you do this treatment and you get rid of the disease in your brain, and that we know that that's just not true.
Right, it's gonna persist, but yeah, there are a lot of big promises, and yes, and again, there are. I think to that end, there are going to be disagreements and criticisms with everything.
Yeah.
But again, I'm here for what's going to work for the person. If it works for that person, let's do that too. Spend less time doing compulsions and more time living your life, however you want to do that. So, I mean, back to the book. I'm curious about, are there some things that I've found, and I've talked to a lot of other therapists, that as folks go through treatment, they start to get to the end of their hierarchy. If you're going through a hierarchical model, that there's a kind of the sticking point of going like, if I do this, I'm becoming a different person. I'm now not the quote OCD person, however offensive that term may be to some people. I'm not going to be that, and I don't know who I'm going to be because I've been this one person for so long. Because for someone who's kind of stuck in that phase, if that my description makes any sense, how would you help this person kind of get up and over that hump?
Yeah, well, so first let me say that I think that very much is the case, that people, not everybody, but there are some people that go through that. They've lived with the disorder for so long, and now all of a sudden, maybe they're getting better, and more of it is expected of them. Now you're going to go to work. We expect you to go to school and get good grades. If you're a kid, we expect you to have relationships. For some folks, that actually holds people back from getting treatment. I'm afraid, what if I can't do it? Right? What if I'm not good at relationships? So the OCD is kind of a safe place for me where I can stay because no one expects me to do that. And I have, kind of a way out, if you will, from having to engage. So yeah, the book, I mean, I think that's a big part of the book is, okay, how do I develop support networks of friendships, and it might even be people from the OCD community who have gone through this before, who can kind of help you. How do I communicate my needs to other people? Other people are going to have, different expectations, or maybe they don't understand what I'm going through. How do I talk about that with other people? How do I assess my need for accommodations at work or school? And maybe over time, some of those start to dwindle because you're doing better, so you don't need extra time and whatnot. So I think that's all very important, and it's complicated and it's different for each person.
Yeah, and all those different points are also specific chapters in this. Those thriving in romantic relationships, navigating work and school. Those are two separate chapters. So, it's saying this is going to go with you into other parts of your life. So, what type of life do you want to create, and how do you make it so that it's livable and workable?
Yeah. I've got a chapter on. I'm looking at the book right now. Yeah. I've got a chapter on time management, right? Which is something that whether you have OCD or you're getting over it, and now all of a sudden you have all this extra time. What am I going to do with that time? So yeah, how do we get control of our time? Is also a big one that people face sometimes.
I've heard that before from folks as they go through treatment. They're doing far fewer. They're like, I have 2 more hours in my day that I can, but like, what do I fill that with? And it's important to fill it with something.
Yes. Oh yeah.
We got to fill it with activities or relationships or hobbies or something, because it's very tempting. Just simply saying don't do X doesn't free you. We have to fill that with something meaningful and important, because otherwise our brain is just going to go right back to the thing that it's always done and feels very comfortable and safe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we know that when people have more time on their hands, that's a recipe for more OCD and anxiety and depression and things like that.
Yeah. That's why the teachers I work with, they hate summer break.
Right.
It's 2 months to obsess.
Yeah, exactly. People like to, it's important to stay busy. I tell that to folks all the time. People are like, well, should I take off work when we're doing treatment? Like, no, unless the OCD is like making you do a bad job at work, don't take off work, keep working. We can use your work as ways to kind of learn how to manage OCD in different situations. And you're busy. You're not just sitting around, yeah.
Right. How do you help someone find a meaningful direction to put that in? Because I think there can be this criticism or some suspiciousness about filling your time with something. Is that a distraction? Is that thought suppression?
Yeah, good question. You got to be careful about that. I think it's important for folks to understand exactly those concepts, Kevin, that you're saying. Like, because people can. Let's say you're not working, and and your therapist says, well, okay, it'd be good to occupy your time. Why don't you find some volunteer work to do? Okay, great. The person goes and volunteers. Now, are you volunteering to try to avoid OCD symptoms, or are you volunteering because you need something to do with your day because you're not doing anything else, or maybe you feel like you want to give back to your community, things like that? Mm-hmm. It's important that the person with OCD isn't doing it as an avoidance, mm-hmm. right? Because that's just going to keep OCD going. And that's not something that people with OCD immediately understand. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that you understand the function of the volunteer work or the work that you're doing, or whatever. Function is important in our field. In cognitive behavior therapy, the function of a behavior, the purpose of it, is more important than what the behavior looks like. Volunteering could be a compulsion.
Exactly.
It could also be a healthy form of treatment, depending on how you're using it.
Right.
So I don't know if that's responding to your question, but you want to understand why are you doing what you're doing? Is it a way of escaping or avoiding from fear, from an obsessional thought, or is it a way of promoting your therapy?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I don't want to monopolize all your time. I know you got other things going on today, but I'm curious, are there other aspects you'd want to address specifically from the book, or maybe perhaps what advice or guidance would you give someone who's kind of in that phase of treatment where they're making progress, they're moving along in therapy, but they're getting stuck they're getting stuck in either incorporating it into the rest of their life, or there's some hurdle in treatment that they just can't surmount?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is make sure that your therapist knows and understands that's where you are. A lot of people just kind of go along with the process and they don't say anything. Maybe they feel badly, or, they're going to feel like a failure. They're going to upset their therapist. No, your therapist needs to know those kinds of things. And very often, there's something that can be done. For everyone, it might be a little bit different, but it could be a matter of how you're implementing exposure. It could be a matter, if you're doing ERP, it could be a matter of, you're doing some subtle ritual or subtle avoidance strategy that's getting in the way. It could be the way that people in your environment are treating you. You could be doing the best treatment, the most successful treatment, and yet if your family is accommodating and they're checking for you, or they're cleaning stuff for you, or giving you reassurance, you're not going to get better. You're taking, a step forward and 2 steps back when you go home.
Right.
And so, a good therapist ought to be able to listen to what you're saying, ask you the right questions to diagnose what might be getting in the way, and then use some sort of intervention, whether it's a family intervention or just changing up the way things are going, to help you out. But that's, they don't teach you that you don't read that in a book about OCD. That's not in our self-help book, and that's not in our treatment manuals. That comes from lots of experience, and learning how to do that. Not every therapist has that, especially, a lot of folks, they go to a weekend workshop and think that, they're an expert therapist. OCD is complicated. I don't have to tell anyone listening to this, let alone you. Right. OCD is complicated. And so finding someone that knows what they're doing is really important.
Right. How do you verify someone's credentials in that?
You ask questions. Yeah. So I've got actually, I forget if it's in this book, although it probably is. I'm actually looking through it right now to see.
Well, as you're looking, I'll say the IOCDF has a great page on how to find a therapist, and they give you all sorts of suggestions and recommendations on questions to ask and recommended answers that you should probably hear from your therapist. So, for example, the question if you're just looking for a random person, perhaps on your insurance panel, and not from finding a therapist who's registered with the IOCDF, you could ask the question, what methods do you use to treat OCD? And if they say CBT, ERP, acceptance and commitment therapy, they haven't added this, but maybe ICBT and maybe some of these other approaches. Great. If they say things like Gestalt therapy and narrative therapy. I don't hate narrative therapy that much. But if they say something, psychodynamically, maybe that's not going to be the best approach.
Nope. Yeah. And so it's not in Living Well with OCD, but it is in one of my other books, Getting Over OCD. The IOCDF pretty much has anything you need about OCD. But yes, and it is not a crime to call up a therapist, ask these questions, spend some time on the phone. They shouldn't charge you for that. Mm-hmm. Because you have a right to know who you're working with. This is going to be, you're going to be, telling this person a lot of intimate stuff about your thoughts and your feelings and all this, and that you're entrusting them, with your mental health. You want to know what you're getting into. So definitely ask those questions.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's so much of therapy that is trust in this person that you're sitting across from, and trusting that they have your best interest at heart, that they're not going to make you or ask you to do anything crazy or illegal or dangerous, genuinely dangerous. So, talking to this person, I've heard clients will say that they've had other therapists say they're not willing to have an initial 10-minute conversation with them until they pay to sit down for the assessment.
Terrible.
Doesn't make any sense to me.
Doesn't make any sense. No, it's bad for business, but it's just unethical.
Right.
Also, yeah.
Exactly. Well, I'll let you go here. I know you got a lot of stuff. I do want to hold you on after we end the call for just one quick question that I'll have off air. But again, I won't take up too much time. But where can people find more about you or your writings?
So I have a website. It's jabramowitz.com. That has lots of background about me and stuff that I've written. I don't do a lot of the social media stuff, but if you Google me, you can find me. I have an Amazon page. I really, it has been my life's work. I don't have OCD. I got interested in grad school. I got assigned to do a paper on OCD and just reading about it and how this is a treatment that can be helpful. And it was the 90s and we didn't know all that much about it. It was actually the late 80s. We didn't know all that much about it. It was an opportunity for me to contribute to the literature and actually worked with someone. One of my first clients that I ever had when I was in grad school had OCD. We did exposure and response prevention. This was someone that was like just non-functional. And within a few months, like they were functioning at a really high rate. I got really lucky to have a great supervisor, and this person worked really hard with me. But it's been my life's work to kind of spread the word and learn about this problem and get the word out there and contribute to the literature and all that. And it's a wonderful, it's a wonderful thing.
That's fantastic. So again, there are people out there who are passionate, love this community, and are wanting the best for folks. So go check him out. He's also on a bunch of other podcasts, a bunch of other YouTube stuff. You can find information about John everywhere. So he's everywhere. Trust me, he's everywhere. Anyways, John, thank you so much. Or excuse me, Dr. Abramowitz, thank you so much for joining us for today.
You bet, Kevin. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Fearcast. If you would like your question answered on a future episode, please click on the Submit a Question link at fearcastpodcast.com. If you would like your question answered sooner, please send me a recording of your question to questions@fearcastpodcast.com or by sending me an audio message through Instagram by DMing me at fearcastpodcast on Instagram. If you like the Fearcast, please write a review on your podcast platform of choice. Please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you need a little bit of help in your recovery, please go over to fearcastpodcast.com and click on the Find Help link, and there's going to be some information for you there. So until next time, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously.